At 4:47 in the morning, on a mountain shrouded in fog and silence, a man who had outrun the CIA, the DEA, and every Mexican president for over a decade was sleeping. Outside, 300 soldiers were moving through the dark. They had 1 minute before everything changed, and in that 1 minute, a question that the entire world had been asking for 15 years was about to be answered. But here is what nobody is telling you. The man they found that morning was not supposed to be there, as someone close to him had made a phone call. And that phone call would trigger the deadliest week Mexico had seen in 20 years. Who betrayed El Mencho? And why did his death make things worse, not better? Stay with us, because this story is only just beginning. The morning of February 22nd, 2026 began like any other morning in Tapalpa, Jalisco, a small colonial mountain town sitting at nearly 7,000 feet above sea level. Tapalpa was the kind of place where tourists came to drink punch, ride horses through pine forests, and escape the noise of Guadalajara just 2 hours away. Old men sat outside the church. Bakeries opened before the sun fully rose. Dogs slept on cobblestone streets. Nothing about Tapalpa suggested it was about to become the most famous town in the world. But deep inside a fortified property on the edge of that town, surrounded by pine trees and armed men, Nemesio Rubén Oseguera Cervantes was in the final hours of his life. The world knew him as El Mencho. The cartels feared him by a dozen different names. The DEA had his face on a $15 million bounty. And on this cold February morning, the Mexican army had found him. Nobody outside of a classified military briefing room knew how they found him. Not yet, but they had found him, and they were already moving. The operation had been planned for 72 hours. It had been kept so secret that even some of the generals involved did not know the full target until 6 hours before boots hit the ground. 300 soldiers from Mexico's elite Special Forces Command had been transported in convoy vehicles with their radio frequencies scrambled. They carried thermal imaging equipment, body cameras, and orders that were deliberately vague in their written form. Then one of the officers, who was later debriefed by investigators, said that when the name of the target finally came across on the encrypted communication channel, the room went completely silent. Nobody said anything for nearly 30 seconds. Then someone said quietly, "Is this real?" It was real. The assault began at 4:47 a.m. The soldiers breached 3 separate entry points simultaneously. The plan was to overwhelm any resistance so quickly that there would be no time to coordinate a defense. What they did not fully anticipate was the loyalty of El Mencho's personal guard, a hand-selected team of former military soldiers, many of whom had once served in the same Mexican army that was now coming through the gates to kill their boss. The gunfight that followed lasted 4 hours and 19 minutes. Tapalpa, a town famous for its silence, erupted into something that residents would later describe as sounding like a full military war. Women pulled children under beds. One bakery owner said he lay flat on the floor of his kitchen for 3 hours, listening to the explosions and trying to count them. A school teacher hiding in her bathroom called her daughter in Guadalajara and told her she loved her because she genuinely did not know if she would survive the morning. Inside the compound, El Mencho's guards fought with a ferocity that surprised even the most experienced Special Forces officers on the ground. These were not ordinary cartel foot soldiers. These were men who had been trained in the same tactics being used against them. They knew how to hold positions. They knew how to funnel attackers into kill zones. They knew how to communicate under pressure. And they were fighting for a man who they believed, genuinely, was more than just their employer. 3 soldiers died in the first 40 minutes. 7 more were wounded seriously enough to require immediate evacuation. But the army had numbers, firepower, and something that El Mencho's men did not. They had already cut off every possible escape route. The roads out of Tapalpa had been blocked since 3 a.m. The helicopters circling overhead made any movement across open ground suicidal. El Mencho's compound, which his people had chosen for its isolation and its defensibility, had become a trap. Inside the main house, in a room that was later described by military sources as surprisingly modest, a simple bed, a wooden table, a photograph on the wall, El Mencho made a decision. The details of exactly what happened next are still disputed. Some accounts from soldiers on the ground say that he attempted to flee through an underground passage that had been built beneath the property. Others say he walked out into the courtyard with a weapon in his hand. What is confirmed, verified by body camera footage that the Mexican government later partially released, is that Nemesio Rubén Oseguera Cervantes was shot 3 times during the final phase of the assault. He was alive when the soldiers reached him. He was placed in a military helicopter at approximately 9:15 a.m. He died before the helicopter reached Mexico City. The Mexican Secretary of Defense announced the death at 11:34 a.m. Within seconds, the news was everywhere. On Twitter, see on WhatsApp group chats, on television screens, in diners and barbershops from Tijuana to Cancun. The President of the United States, who was preparing his State of the Union address for 2 days later, was informed immediately. The White House released a statement within the hour. The DEA administrator got the news on her phone while she was in a meeting. She stepped out of the room, walked down the hallway to her private office, closed the door, and reportedly sat in silence for several minutes before making any calls. One person who was present in that building that morning said it felt less like a celebration and more like the moment before a thunderstorm, when the air goes very still and everything feels suspended. That feeling was accurate, because while the world was reacting to the death of one of the most wanted criminals in human history, something else was already beginning. In cities across Mexico, WhatsApp messages were moving at extraordinary speed through networks that most people never see. Cartel lieutenants were receiving information, orders were being given, men with guns were climbing into vehicles. The violence that followed El Mencho's death would kill more than 70 people in the next 72 hours. It would shut down airports. It would trap tourists. It would force an entire nation to confront a question that had no comfortable answer. Had anything actually changed? To understand why that question matters, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to the raid, not even to the founding of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. You have to go back to a small farming village in Michoacan in the late 1960s, where a boy named Nemesio was born into a family that had almost nothing. The village of Naranjo de Chila sits in the mountains of Michoacan, in a region so poor and so isolated that for much of the 20th century, the Mexican government barely knew it existed. There were no paved roads. There was no reliable electricity. The families who lived there survived on corn farming, lime cultivation, and the income sent back by relatives who had made the journey north to California to pick fruit. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes was born into one of these families in 1966 or 1967. Official records from this period and region are inconsistent, and even the DEA lists his birth year with uncertainty. What is known is that he grew up watching his family struggle. His father worked the land. His mother raised children in a house with dirt floors. From a very young age, Nemesio understood that the village offered one path, and one path only: poverty, labor, and an early death from either sickness or exhaustion. He left when he was still a teenager. The first stop was Guadalajara, the second largest city in Mexico. For a young man from the mountains with no education, no connections, and no money, Guadalajara in the 1980s was overwhelming and indifferent. The city had no interest in who he was or where he came from. He worked odd jobs. He lived in cramped rooms. He learned quickly that there were two economies operating in the city: the visible one, which offered almost nothing to someone like him, and the invisible one, which offered everything. The invisible economy was the drug trade. In the 1980s, Guadalajara was one of the most important hubs of drug trafficking in the entire hemisphere. The Guadalajara Cartel, led by Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, was at the peak of its power. Cocaine from Colombia was moving through Guadalajara on its way to the United States. The men who worked in the cartel's networks lived in houses, drove new cars, wore gold chains, and commanded a kind of respect on the street that no legitimate job could ever provide. For a young man from the mountains with nothing, this was not a difficult calculation. Nemesio began working in low-level drug distribution. Nobody at that time would have predicted greatness or infamy for him. He was simply one of thousands of young men from poor regions who had drifted into the drug economy because the drug economy was the only economy that had a door open for them. He was quiet. He was observant. He watched how things worked. He learned who answered to whom and why. He made himself useful without making himself conspicuous. But the trajectory of his life changed in a way that almost nobody predicted when he made a decision that, at the time, seemed completely counterintuitive. He joined the police. In the early 1990s, Nemesio Oseguera became a police officer in Guadalajara. He later also served as a federal transit officer. This is a fact that shocks people when they first hear it, because it seems impossible to reconcile the enforcer of the law with the man who would later build one of the most brutal criminal empires in history. But in the context of Mexico in the 1990s, it makes perfect sense. Law enforcement in Mexico at that time was less a career and more an information network. Police officers knew where drugs moved. They knew which politicians took money and which ones refused. They knew which military commanders were on the payroll. Being a police officer gave you access to information, and information was worth more than money. He was also, during this period, developing a different kind of education. He had married into a family with deep cartel connections. His wife, Rosalinda González Valencia, was the sister of the González Valencia brothers, a powerful family with established ties to the Milenio Cartel, which operated throughout Jalisco and Colima. Through this marriage, Nemesio gained something that money alone could never buy: family. In the Mexican cartel world, family was the ultimate currency. He was eventually arrested by American authorities. He was deported back to Mexico. He was charged, released, disappeared back into the world. And then he met Ignacio Nacho Coronel. Nacho Coronel was one of the most powerful figures in the Sinaloa cartel. A man of considerable intelligence and even more considerable ruthlessness, so Coronel recognized something in the young, quiet man from Michoacán that others had missed. He saw organizational ability. He saw loyalty. He saw someone who understood both the street level and the institutional level, someone who had walked on both sides and learned from both. Coronel Made El Mencho, a key operator in Jalisco. When Coronel was killed by the Mexican military in 2010, the Sinaloa cartel expected Jalisco to simply fold into their wider operation. This was their first major miscalculation. Instead, the men who had been loyal to Coronel, among them Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, who by now had fully embraced the name El Mencho, made a different decision. They declared independence. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, or CJNG, was born in 2010. Its stated position was simple and terrifying. It would not bow to the Sinaloa cartel. It would not bow to the Zetas. It would not bow to anyone. Say it would take Jalisco and then it would take Mexico. Most people in the underworld laughed. Nobody was laughing by 2013. The speed with which the CJNG grew under El Mencho's leadership is one of the most remarkable organizational stories of the early 21st century, criminal or otherwise. Within 3 years of its founding, the cartel had established operations in 22 of Mexico's 31 states. Within 5 years, it had a presence in over 40 countries. It moved methamphetamine, fentanyl, cocaine, and heroin. It laundered money through restaurants, construction companies, car dealerships, and agricultural operations. It recruited with a sophistication that rivaled multinational corporations, competitive pay, military-grade weapons, a clear hierarchy, and, most importantly, a culture of loyalty built around El Mencho himself. He was not simply a boss, he was a myth. In the communities around Guadalajara and Jalisco where the cartel operated, El Mencho cultivated a carefully managed image of a man who came from the people and had not forgotten the people. Food distributions, school supplies, medical clinics funded by cartel money in villages where the government provided nothing. He was portrayed in narco corridos and in social media accounts managed by cartel operatives, or as a kind of Robin Hood figure, a man who fought the corrupt establishment with the only tools available to someone who had grown up with dirt floors and no options. This image was, of course, constructed and maintained through terror. The other side of the CJNG under El Mencho was one of staggering violence. The cartel pioneered the use of military-style tactics and weaponry that had previously been associated only with national armed forces. They used armored vehicles. They used drones to drop improvised explosive devices on police convoys. In 2015, they shot down a military helicopter with a rocket launcher. The video of that helicopter falling from the sky and bursting into flames was shared millions of times and sent a message to every level of Mexican law enforcement and government. We are not afraid of you, and you should be afraid of us. The person at the center of all of it, the strategy, the violence, the expansion, the mythology, was El Mencho himself. But who was he, really? People who claim to have known him personally and who have spoken carefully and anonymously to journalists and investigators describe a man who is nothing like the image. They describe someone quiet, controlled, not given to displays of rage because he did not need to display rage. People understood that crossing him would result in consequences so severe that the display was unnecessary. He was described as intelligent, in a practical, instinctive way. Not educated, but deeply perceptive about people, about incentives, about how organizations worked and how they failed. He was also described as a devoted father. This detail is complicated because his son, Rubén Oseguera González, known as El Menchito, was arrested in Mexico in 2015 and eventually extradited to the United States, where he faces federal drug charges. His daughter Jessica was also arrested. His extended family became a vulnerability. In a world where loyalty was everything, the imprisonment of his children was both a personal wound and a strategic problem. There are people who believe it also made him more dangerous, that the loss of his children to American prisons intensified something in El Mencho, made him less cautious, more willing to escalate. The escalation came. In 2019, the cartel ambushed a military convoy in Michoacán and killed 13 soldiers. The Mexican government, under President López Obrador, launched an operation to capture El Mencho's son. And then, in one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of the Mexican drug war, backed down. A convoy carrying El Menchito was surrounded by thousands of armed cartel members in the streets of Culiacán. The government, calculating that the cost in civilian lives would be too high, ordered the release of the prisoner. El Menchito was freed. El Mencho watched, and he understood something critical. The Mexican state, as powerful as it appeared, had limits, and those limits could be pushed. This was the man that 300 soldiers were going to arrest on a foggy mountain morning in February of 2026. This was the myth they were going to shatter. But myths do not shatter cleanly. They break in ways that send fragments flying. The question of how the military found El Mencho in Tapalpa is one that will occupy intelligence analysts, journalists, and cartel historians for years. Several theories have emerged, and none of them are fully confirmed. The first theory is the one that the Mexican government prefers, that months of signals intelligence, combined with surveillance of known associates, eventually led investigators to the property in Tapalpa. This is plausible. The DEA and the NSA had been pooling resources on the El Mencho case for over a decade. The technology available to American intelligence, satellite imagery, phone intercept programs, financial tracking is formidable. The second theory is darker and more in keeping with how these things usually work in Mexico. Someone talked. The cartel world operates on two competing forces, loyalty and fear. Loyalty keeps organizations together. Fear keeps individual members in line. But when the balance shifts, when a lieutenant begins to calculate that the risk of staying loyal is higher than the risk of talking, the entire structure becomes vulnerable. There are people inside the cartel investigation community who believe that the intelligence which led soldiers to Tapalpa came not from a satellite or a phone intercept, but from inside the CJNG itself. A name that has circulated in these discussions, always anonymously, always with the caveat that nothing has been confirmed, is Juan Carlos González Valencia, known as El Contador. He is the stepson of El Mencho and one of the figures identified by analysts as a potential successor. The theory, which is unverified, is that internal power struggles within the CJNG had been intensifying in the months before the Tapalpa raid, and that someone with access to El Mencho's location had decided to accelerate the succession by the most direct method available. Whether or not this theory is true, it matters enormously. Because if El Mencho was betrayed from inside, it changes everything about what happens next. It means the CJNG is not a unified organization mourning its leader. It means the CJNG is a fractured organization in the middle of a war for succession, with factions that are already armed, already organized, and already willing to do whatever it takes. This possibility was very much on the minds of the officials who gathered in the National Palace in Mexico City on the afternoon of February 22nd, as the president prepared to address the nation. The address was measured and careful. The president spoke of the operation as a victory for the rule of law, for the Mexican state, for the families of the thousands of people who had been killed or displaced by cartel violence in Jalisco and surrounding states. He thanked the armed forces. He thanked the intelligence community. He did not specifically thank the United States, though privately, in conversations that were later reported, Mexican officials expressed deep discomfort with the degree of American involvement in the operation. Trump, 2 days later, had no such discomfort. Standing at the podium for his State of the Union address, he paused from his remarks on immigration and trade to announce with visible satisfaction, "We've also taken down one of the most sinister cartel kingpins." He made no mention of the Mexican military or the Mexican government. He presented it as an American victory. In Mexico City, in the offices of senior government officials who had been briefed on the classified details of the operation, this moment landed very badly. One diplomat with knowledge of the discussions described the reaction as fury contained behind diplomatic language. But that fury was immediately overshadowed by something far more urgent. Because by the time Trump was giving his State of the Union address, Mexico was already burning. The violence began within hours of the death announcement. It began in Jalisco, which anyone who understood the CJNG could have predicted. But it spread faster and further than almost any official had anticipated. Within the first 24 hours, roadblocks made of burning vehicles had appeared on highways across Jalisco, Colima, Guanajuato, Michoacán, Nayarit, and Veracruz. This was not spontaneous grief. This was organized. This required coordination, vehicles, fuel, and personnel positioned across 20 states simultaneously. This was a message. The CJNG was telling the Mexican government, and telling it very clearly. The organization did not die with El Mencho. The organization was still here. The organization could still reach everywhere, and the organization was angry. The human cost of that message was catastrophic. More than 70 people were killed in the 72 hours following the death announcement. Among them were 25 National Guard members killed in an ambush on a convoy in Jalisco, the deadliest single attack on Mexican security forces in recent memory. First responders in 3 different cities were targeted specifically, the vehicles that came to respond to initial incidents being attacked in coordinated ambushes designed to maximize casualties and create maximum fear. Airports were shut down. Aeromexico and Volaris canceled dozens of flights to and from Guadalajara, Puerto Vallarta, and Manzanillo. Thousands of tourists were stranded. Social media filled with videos of confused and frightened American and European tourists sheltering in hotel lobbies, calling their embassies, asking questions that nobody could fully answer. The American State Department issued a Level 4 travel warning, "Do not travel," for Jalisco state. It was the same level applied to active war zones. In the hotels, in the WhatsApp groups, in the frantic phone calls between stranded tourists and their families back home. A version of the same conversation was happening over and over again. I thought they said this was over. I thought they got him. Why is it still happening? Why is it still happening? This is the question that lives at the heart of the entire El Mencho story, and it is the question that separates a surface-level news story from a genuine reckoning with the reality of what has been built in Mexico over the past 30 years. The Kingpin strategy, the idea that killing or capturing the top leader of a criminal organization will cause that organization to collapse, has been the central logic of the Mexican drug war since at least 2006, when President Felipe Calderón declared war on the cartels and unleashed the military against them. In the years since, Mexico has killed or captured an extraordinary number of cartel leaders. El Chapo was captured, extradited, convicted, and imprisoned in a Supermax facility in Colorado. The leaders of the Zetas, the Beltran-Leyva cartel, the Gulf cartel have been killed, arrested, or have died in various circumstances. And yet, the cartels have not collapsed. They have not even diminished meaningfully. What they have done is fracture, reorganize, and in some ways become more dangerous and more diffuse. Precisely because the removal of central leadership has eliminated the organizational discipline that strong central leadership provides. Anthropologists and criminologists call this the Hydra effect. Cut off one head and two grow in its place, not because of any mystical resilience, but because the underlying conditions that created the first head have not changed. The poverty, the corruption, the porous border, the insatiable American appetite for drugs, the weapons flowing south from the United States, the economic calculation that faces a young man in Naranjo de Chila today is not meaningfully different from the one that faced a young Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes 50 years ago. As long as those conditions exist, someone will step into the space that El Mencho's death has created. The question is who? Within the CJNG, the succession question is being debated, not in boardrooms, but in encrypted messages, in armed confrontations, in the positioning of forces across Jalisco and beyond. El Contador has been named as one possible successor. Others have been named too, regional commanders who have spent years building their own networks, their own loyalties, their own revenue streams, and who now see El Mencho's death as either a catastrophe to be avenged or an opportunity to be seized. There are former cartel analysts who believe that the violence that followed El Mencho's death was not just a message to the government. They believe it was also a message between cartel factions, a demonstration of strength designed not for the soldiers at checkpoints, but for the lieutenants watching from the inside, trying to decide which way to move. If that is true, Mexico is not at the end of the CJNG era. It is at the beginning of something even more unpredictable. The families of the soldiers who died in Tapalpa and in the subsequent wave of violence are dealing with grief that has no political calculation attached to it. A woman in Guadalajara whose husband died in the ambush that killed 25 National Guard members gave a brief interview to a local news station 3 days after the raid. She did not talk about the Kingpin strategy or cartel succession. She said very simply that her husband had gone to work and had not come home, and that her children were asking questions she did not know how to answer. Her name was not given. She did not want her name given. She did not want to become a target. This detail alone says something profound about the situation in Mexico. That a widow, a woman who had just lost her husband in official military service, was afraid to give her name to a journalist because she feared cartel retaliation. This is not a country that has won a war on drugs. This is a country still living inside one. The survivors of the civilian violence in those 72 hours tell similar stories. A shopkeeper in Zapopan whose store was burned in what appeared to be a cartel sweep through the neighborhood. A truck driver who was stopped at a roadblock and whose vehicle was set on fire after he was forced to evacuate. A family from Guadalajara who had driven to Colima for a long weekend and found themselves trapped for 4 days because every road out was either blocked or too dangerous to travel. These are not statistics. These are people, and their experiences were directly caused by the death of one man, except that the cause and effect runs deeper than that, because El Mencho's death was itself caused by 15 years of failure to address the conditions that produced him. In Washington, the celebration was real but short-lived. Intelligence officials who appeared before congressional committees in the weeks following the Tapalpa raid were measured in their assessments. Yes, the removal of El Mencho was significant. Yes, it disrupted CJNG operations, at least temporarily. The fentanyl supply chains that pass through CJNG-controlled territory were experiencing disruption. The financial networks were scrambled. The internal politics of the cartel were, in the language of intelligence analysts, in flux. But none of them used the word victory. The DEA administrator, in testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was asked directly whether the death of El Mencho had made America safer from fentanyl. She paused for a long moment before she answered. "We have removed a key node," she said. "We have not changed the network. The network is built from everything El Mencho spent his life constructing. Relationships with corrupt officials at every level of Mexican government. Financial structures spread across dozens of countries and thousands of shell companies. Supply chains that run from the precursor chemical factories of China through Mexican ports to distribution networks in American cities. Human networks of distributors, enforcers, lookouts, and money launderers numbering in the tens of thousands. El Mencho built this network over 30 years. He built it by being ruthless when ruthlessness was required, and by being generous when generosity served a purpose. He built it by understanding, better than almost anyone else in his world, that an organization's strength is not in its weapons, but in its relationships, in the web of dependencies and loyalties and fears that make people stay and make them fight. He built it, ultimately, because he was allowed to build it. Because the conditions in Mexico that make cartels possible, the poverty, the inequality, the institutional corruption, the absence of economic alternatives, are not conditions that any government has seriously committed to changing. His body was taken to Mexico City and examined by forensic teams. The official cause of death was confirmed as gunshot wounds sustained during the Tapalpa operation. There was no funeral, not a public one anyway. His remains were handed to family members under conditions of extreme secrecy. The Mexican government was not going to create a grave that could become a shrine. But the shrine does not need a grave. In the communities around Guadalajara, the narco corridos began appearing within 24 hours of the death announcement. Songs praising El Mencho's courage, lamenting his loss, promising that his work would continue. Or murals in alleyways that the authorities would paint over and that would reappear within days. Social media accounts created and immediately banned that would reappear under different names. The myth-making had begun. And this is perhaps the most unsettling element of the entire story, because it means that even in death, El Mencho continues to perform a function inside the communities where the CJNG operates. He becomes a martyr. He becomes a symbol. He becomes the proof that a boy from a dirt-floor house in Naranjo de Chila could rise to a point where the CIA, the DEA, and the Mexican army spent 15 years and enormous resources trying to find him. In a context where legitimate paths to power and dignity are absent, this story, however horrific its actual content, carries a meaning that governments are not equipped to compete with. This is not a justification for anything El Mencho did. The people he ordered killed. The communities he terrorized, the families destroyed by the fentanyl that his organization flooded into American cities. These are not abstractions. They are human beings whose lives were ended or devastated by decisions made by this man. But it is an explanation. And explanations matter because without them, the next Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes is already being born somewhere, in conditions that are producing him as surely as a factory produces a product. 3 weeks after the Tapalpa raid, the situation in Jalisco had stabilized on the surface. The airport was operating again. The roadblocks were gone. The tourists were back. The burned vehicles had been cleared from the highways. Official statements from both the Mexican and American governments described the situation as under control. Cartel analysts, tracking movement and communications through open-source intelligence methods, described something different. They described a CJNG that was reorganizing rapidly, that was establishing new command structures, that was, in some regions, already engaged in low-level armed conflict with rival groups who had moved into territory that the operational confusion of El Mencho's death had temporarily opened. The Sinaloa cartel, which had spent 15 years watching the CJNG with a mixture of hostility and grudging respect, was watching very carefully. Other groups, smaller, regional, opportunistic, were watching too. The territory that El Mencho built did not disappear with him. It was simply available for someone else to claim. And in a town somewhere in Mexico, perhaps in Jalisco, perhaps in Michoacan, perhaps in one of the other states where the CJNG has deep roots, a young man with no money and no options and no reason to trust that the legitimate economy will ever offer him anything, was watching the news about El Mencho and doing a calculation. The same calculation a boy from Naranjo de Chila once did. The system that produced El Mencho is intact. The man is gone. The system remains. And the question that every government official, every intelligence analyst, every journalist covering this story has to eventually answer. Not for a press release, not for a committee hearing, but for themselves, honestly, is what they are prepared to actually do about that. Not about El Mencho, about the conditions that make El Monchos, Because as long as those conditions exist, the man they buried without a public funeral will be replaced. Maybe not by one person, maybe by several, maybe by a fractured competition that produces violence more chaotic and more unpredictable than anything El Mencho, in his controlled and calculating way, ever chose to deploy. The soldiers who went up that mountain on a cold February morning did something remarkable. They found a man who had hidden from the most powerful surveillance apparatus in human history for 15 years. They mounted an operation of extraordinary logistical complexity in complete secrecy. They suffered losses and they fought through them. By any military standard, what happened in Tapalpa was a success. But a military success and a social success are not the same thing. The families of the dead soldiers know this. The widow who would not give her name to the television camera knows this. The shopkeeper in Zapopan, whose store was burned, knows this. The truck driver who had to watch his vehicle set on fire while armed men stood around it knows this. They know it because they live in it. They live in the world that the drug war has produced, not the world that the drug war was supposed to produce. They live in the gap between the press conference and the reality. And they will continue to live there long after El Mencho's name has faded from the headlines. The story of Nemesio Rubén Oseguera Cervantes ends in a helicopter over Mexico, bleeding from 3 gunshot wounds, dying on the way to a city that had spent 15 years trying to catch him. The story of what he built, what he represented, and what he revealed about the world that made him. That story is nowhere near its end. And that is precisely why you need to keep watching. The aftermath of El Mencho's death is unfolding right now, in ways that most coverage is not showing you. If you want to understand who is moving to fill the vacuum, what the CJNG looks like without its founder, and what the next chapter of this war actually means, subscribe to this channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss it. If this documentary gave you something to think about, drop a comment below. Tell us what surprised you. Tell us what you already knew. Tell us what you want us to cover next. And if you believe this story matters, if you think more people should understand what is actually happening in Mexico and what it means for the rest of the world, share this video. One share reaches people that the algorithm never will. We'll see you in the next one.